While Chrysler would introduce its minivan in 1984 to rave success, in fact, some would argue the minivan and indeed the K-car platform was what really saved Chrysler, it would take General Motors until the 1990 model year for it to introduce its own version of a minivan, particularly the Pontiac Trans Sport that we're going to talk about today. The Transport was just one of the minivans. The Chevrolet Lumina APV, or all-purpose vehicle, was another that was introduced for 1990. There would eventually be the complementary Oldsmobile Silhouette as well. And a lot of us will refer to these vans as so-called Dustbusters because of their appearance with this long, sloping windshield. It's almost like a reversed fastback design with an interesting basket handle styling, that sheet metal that goes and wraps over top of the vehicle, breaking up all of the glass panes. But what we're going to discuss today is a very special Pontiac Transport, one that I'm pretty sure that you haven't seen, and that is the one that was exported to Europe. And what makes it so special? Well, let's discuss. Now, first of all, you have the sheet metal, well, I guess I should call it the sheet metal and fascia, on the export version of the Pontiac Transport were different from the U.S. version. Take a look at the front end of this export version of the Transport, and you'll notice one principal difference up front in the fascia area, and that is that this is wearing the Oldsmobile Silhouette fascia. Now, what's going on here? Well, the Pontiac Transports that were exported overseas actually were rebadged Oldsmobile Silhouettes that had the Pontiac badge up front, but the old styling overall, and they did lack that Oldsmobile Silhouette black stripe or series of black stripes down the side. Now, why Pontiac elected to do that, I am not quite sure. I wonder if it has to do with the airflow through those grills on the U.S. version. Perhaps there was some issue with it, and they felt that they needed to change the old Silhouette styling. Otherwise, I just can't think of any other reason why they would do that. And now let's take a look out back, and you'll notice a couple of profound differences. Obviously, the license plate provision here is much larger for the European plates. You do have the standard hatch release there, as well as the rear wiper. But take a look up top, and you'll notice that the stop lamps and turn signals are different on the European version. More specifically, you have amber lights out back. The U.S. version just had red tail lights that also functioned as turn signals. And that was something that was always true in the U.S. and generally different in Europe, was that Europe forced the turn signals to be amber. And candidly, it makes more sense. In the U.S., you would have a light that would function as a stoplight as well as the turn signal and be red, and it just didn't make all that much sense. This is actually a better setup. You also have the auxiliary driving lamps down below, and the reverse light is much larger and different than it was on the U.S. version. You'll also notice here that it says Pontiac on the back. There's a Pontiac badge on the left-hand side. And do you notice what it says on the right there? It says 2.3 liter, 16 valve. Now, what in the world is going on here? A 2.3 liter engine and 16 valve? They didn't have that in the United States Pontiac Transport, did they? No, they didn't. This actually has a very unique powertrain under hood. But first, we're going to go to the inside because there's another interesting powertrain element that you're going to see in these photos. And now let's take a look at the interior. You'll notice some very familiar bits of trim, the instrument panel, the Pontiac steering wheel. And, well, there's something different, though, about the inside here, and that is that manual transmission. Yes, this has a 5-speed manual transmission. So not only did you get a manual transmission, you got a 2.3-liter 16-valve 4-cylinder under hood. And what was that 4-cylinder? Well, it was the infamous Quad 4 engine from the United States. Yes, that's right. While the minivans in the U.S. may do a 3.1-liter, 3.4-liter, and 3.8-liter V6s under hood in various years, the export version of the Transport actually had the Quad 4 4-cylinder under hood, and it was often teamed with a 5-speed manual transmission because Europe, up until very recently, many European cars had manual transmissions. It's only been in the last 10 years or so that automatics have started to take over from manual transmissions. So this was a powertrain combination that was not offered in the United States. Here's another photo from the passenger side. Notice that this also has a handbrake, emergency brake. So a couple things well, a lot of things that you couldn't get in the U.S. I think it's pretty humorous that this was the content in Europe. But I guess it makes sense. I mean, Europe was obviously much more fuel economy conscious because of the relative pricing of gasoline versus the United States. And then, of course, the quad 4 engine was double overhead cam 4-cylinder engine, tended to make more sense than a push rod engine if you're going to be doing a decent amount of higher speed driving. So probably wasn't a bad powertrain combination for Europe. And while there was the quad 4 underhood in the export version, in this particular case, you could also get a 1.9 liter Peugeot diesel underhood. So you could get all different powertrains from what was available in the U.S. Diesels, again, being very popular in Europe versus the United States. Diesel fuel in Europe was very plentiful as well as cheaper than gasoline in this era. And as a consequence, like I said, many customers would opt for that. So again, you could get a 2.3 liter quad 4 or you could get a 1.9 liter Peugeot diesel under the export version of your Pontiac Transport's hood. Now, turning back to the exterior for a second, take a look at this different export version of the Transport. Still has the 2.3 liter quad 4 badging on the back. But you do notice in this photo something you didn't quite see in the other one, and that is the turn signal repeater that is on the fender there right behind the front wheel. Again, something that was not on the U.S. cars because it just wasn't required. The lamps that wrapped around the fascia sufficed for the side marker lamps, but that was not sufficient for Europe, and so Pontiac had to add those on. You can also see from this view the basket handle styling of the Transport with that sheet metal piece that goes up and along the roof, and I think that's a nice touch on these vans. It just kind of emulates other Pontiacs, including the Firebirds as an example, that had that basket handle styling in the, well, this time as well as the 1982 Firebird all the way through the end of the run of that particular generation F-body. And here's a look inside because the Transport offered something similar, whether in Europe or in the United States, and that was this concept of modular seating. You can see the seats were individual seats. This was something, GM was trying to one-up Chrysler during this time frame because they were so much later to market than Chrysler was on minivans. And so in the U.S., as opposed to having bench seating like the Chryslers did, they had individual modular seating. You could remove these individual seat modules relatively easily. You could configure them. You could remove 1, 2, whatever combination you wanted. I also love that they all have cup holders molded into the back because you obviously have to have a place to put your cup. Of course, those cup holders clearly aren't very deep, so you better not be driving anywhere and assuming that they're just going to hold whatever beverage you have in place, because clearly they're not. But that was something that these vans offered that was different from Chrysler, and I don't think it was all that bad of an idea. It was much easier then to remove a seat. You didn't need to really strain your back or use 2 people to get a bench seat out. You could just pick one of these seats up. I think they weighed about 35 pounds or so, 40 pounds. They weren't all that heavy. And, configure your van appropriately. It was a good idea, but I think customers weren't quite sold on the concept of this van overall because it just looked so strange relative to what else was on the market. And talk about strange, here's an Iveco truck transporting a series of these Transports. Haha, nice pun. I can't imagine seeing this going down the road, and, well, in Europe, it just must have been a strange sight. Unfortunately, the Transport never really took off in the U.S., nor did the Lumina APV, nor the Silhouette. I think the styling was just a bridge too far for many people. This kind of reversed fastback, slant nose, anteater, dustbuster-like look was just too futuristic at the time. But I do think it makes for a super cool collectible, and I actually tend to like the styling. The other thing I will say, though, is that this steeply sloped windshield certainly created an oversized dashboard. And then because of that oversized dashboard, in the first model year, 1990, a number of customer complaints occurred because the dashboard was allegedly reflecting into the windshield. It was also hard to clean the windshield. In fact, some dealers had special tools to clean the front of the windshield because that dash was just so long. But the next model year, GM would actually put a no-gloss kind of carpet at the front of the dash to try to mitigate some of that glare. And it was overall just an interesting, different, kind of, well, quirky design that, like I said, unfortunately didn't catch on in the United States, but it's certainly made for a cool van. We'll interview the chief designer of this van, Dick Rusin, at some point here in the near-term future to get his thoughts on it and what the team was thinking. Until then, we'll take a look at this clay model of the Lumina APV, the Lumina version of the Transport, out on GM Design Center's patio. And clearly this is near the end, although it looks like designers are evaluating a couple different graphics packages. You can see the red stripe on the one side and the blue stripe on the other. And notice the badging or the sticker on the door that says Super Sport. So I don't know what was going to go on there. Maybe this was a supposedly up-level sporty trim package that was going to be sold on this particular van. And then here's another model with the GM design team. Dick Rusin is a gentleman in the foreground at the left wearing the glasses and the black suit. I actually think this is a pretty handsome front end. My guess is that metal honeycomb-esque grill and the front end were just deemed to be too costly by the bean counters, and so they had to go with the alternate proposal that you saw. But I don't really know the story. That's something that we'll have to talk to Dick about, so stay tuned. Again, just an awesome, extremely futuristic piece of design, and imagine that this vehicle was designed in the 1980s. I mean, it looks like something that's still futuristic today. I wish that I could say that about cars on the road today. Many of them just look like blobby crossovers. Oh, well. So this Lumina APV Pontiac Transport, in particular the Pontiac Transport Export, is a pretty sweet vehicle. I hope you enjoyed the spotlight on what I think is one of the coolest minivans that GM ever produced. Probably the coolest. And in closing, I did find this photo of a 1990 Pontiac Transport Export version. You'll notice here that it has that twin split grille, and perhaps this is the reason why Pontiac ended up going to the Oldsmobile silhouette styling. Notice the license plate is blocking the air intake there. So that might be one of the major reasons why they changed. The other photo was of approximately a 1994 Export version Transport that had the silhouette style fascia. And you can see here in the 1990 version that it has the quad sealed beam style headlamp similar to what was employed on the 1989-88 Chevrolet CK pickup, including that bezel. So an interesting overall evolution of this Export Transport from using some of the Pontiac styling to eventually changing over to the Oldsmobile styling, perhaps, like I said, because of that license plate blocking the grille and consequently the intake air volume. Thanks again for watching.